The old oven struggled to reach its set temperature of 375 degrees as I kicked the hissing box of scrap metal in frustration. The partially hinged door fell open, causing me to mutter a curse under my breath. After slamming the door shut, I set down the overloaded paper bags and assessed my injuries. My shoulder throbbed, but the oven continued to whistle and wheeze behind me, unfazed. As I unpacked the groceries, arranging them in an orderly pile, I realized that I had nearly exhausted this week's grocery budget. There were some eggs, potatoes, and a small slab of red meat, but the rest of the items were for my special recipe. Everything hinged on tonight's dinner party, and I had high hopes that my guests would be impressed. I pulled out my phone and clicked on a link saved in my favorites, taking me to a blog with overly cutesy but well-put-together pictures of desserts. Scrolling past pictures of macarons and paleo cookies, I stumbled upon an eye-catching title, Death by Chocolate Cake. The proprietor of the blog blabbed about the warm, cozy evening that had inspired the recipe with her hubby, but I quickly swiped past the nauseating confession of love to read the recipe. My heart raced as I read the instructions, hoping that farm girl city chef knew what she was talking about. With fingers crossed, I began to prepare the ingredients, hoping that the old oven would cooperate long enough to bake the cake to perfection. The process of preparing the dry mix was effortless, but handling the chocolate proved to be quite challenging. The initial batch turned out lumpy with an uneven, smoky brown hue. Despite being at the early stages of the task, I felt frustrated and picked up the remaining chocolate packets. I swiftly chopped the dark chocolate into small slivers, followed by the milk and white chocolate. Each pile of shavings was placed in a separate glass bowl and mixed with a splash of heavy cream. As I whisked the delicate mixtures, I was unaware of the sound of the keys rattling in the lock or the firm shutting of the door. Slowly turning around with one of the molten chocolate mixtures in my hand, I accidentally dropped it at the sight of a dark silhouette standing in the kitchen doorway. The mixture splattered and scattered into a pile of chocolate-covered shards. My husband knelt down to pick up a piece of the already hardening mess and pretended to put it into his mouth. He exclaimed that it was a dangerously delicious treat. Despite his pallid complexion and the dark circles under his eyes, he beamed with a smile, which I happily reciprocated by giving him a playful slap on the shoulder and a kiss. "You scared me," I exclaimed, pretending to sulk as I crossed my arms. He drew me closer to him, peppering my face and neck with loud smacks. "I'm sorry, love. What are you making there?" He gestured towards the scattered mess on the floor and the 2 bowls remaining on the stove. "That," I replied with a wide grin, "is a triple-layered triple chocolate, Death by Chocolate Cake." His eyebrows shot up in cartoonish excitement, causing me to hit him on the chest, laughing. "Stop it," I chided, still giggling. "No, seriously, that sounds amazing. What's the occasion?" I looked up at him with innocent, wide eyes, already knowing what I had to say. "Did you forget, baby? It's your mother's birthday today." He tensed up and recoiled from me. "That woman is not my mother," he spat. "Of course, love, but she is technically family." I trailed off, noticing his continued pallor and now simmering anger. Although he appeared as if he wanted to strike me, he refrained. Instead, he swiftly unfastened his jacket and flung it, along with his briefcase, onto the countertop. "Tidy up this chaos," he demanded, before vanishing into the bedroom. Feeling relieved by his aggressive reaction, I blended the melted chocolate with my dry ingredients and mixed them until they formed a fluffy and even batter. Draped and layered in an array of exquisite silks, she sat comfortably, some of the fabric resting on her thigh, and the rest delicately held at her neck. Even the intricate linings of her hands looked expensive against our shabby table. Her chin remained firmly up in the air as she scrutinized our tiny apartment, even as she ate. As she finished her meal, I cleared the empty dishes and serving platters, before returning with the cake, which I carefully placed in front of her. She formed a smile with her perfect teeth, one that didn't seem entirely insincere. "How kind of you! You really didn't have to go to this trouble," she exclaimed, looking towards my husband, who seemed to be lost in thought. "Of course, Ms. Harizo. After Mr. Harizo's passing, we imagined you must be feeling incredibly lonely. Despite our disagreements in the past, we believe that no one should spend their birthday alone," I replied. "I'm pleased that you both recognize that this is for the best," she said, clasping her hands together and causing her diamond rings to make a cold, clicking sound. "Your father had faith in you, Morgan. He wouldn't have taken this step otherwise." Morgan's gaze was so intense that I was surprised the woman could withstand it for as long as she did. She eventually turned away, seemingly unfazed. "Let's cut the cake, dear," she said knowingly. I pulled the cake out of the cardboard box. "I apologize for getting a store-bought cake. We've both been so busy," I said with a laugh. Now it was my turn to receive Morgan's intense stare. His eyes narrowed, but he remained silent. "Don't worry about it. It's the thought that counts," she reassured me. I piled a large slice onto her plate. "Wow, that looks delicious. I wouldn't have known it wasn't homemade," she exclaimed. I grinned widely. "Let's hope it tastes as good as it looks." Despite her petite stature, she took a surprisingly large bite of the cake. The only sounds in the room were the humming of the overhead fan and the delightful munching of the dessert. Once finished, she used a folded napkin to wipe the corners of her mouth before placing it back on her lap. "That was absolutely marvelous," she declared. "I'm glad you enjoyed it," I replied, while my husband cleared the table. The air was thick with an uncomfortable silence as we waited for his return. When he finally came back, the guest looked at her Rolex and then at my husband, seemingly expecting something. Avoiding eye contact, my husband suggested, "It's getting late now. You should probably head home." "You're right. I'm sure Twinkles is wondering what I'm doing out so late," she said, but made no attempt to gather her belongings. "I'll go grab your coat for you," I offered. "Would you mind getting me a glass of water first?" she asked, delicately placing her hands on her throat. "Sure," I said. I handed her a glass of water, but when she attempted to chug it, her throat, which was likely the size of a pinhole at that moment, failed her. The glass landed on the carpet without breaking, as she inadvertently sprayed water across the table. Gasping for air, she clutched her throat in desperation, wheezing uncontrollably. Her labored breaths were accompanied by a thin whistling sound, eerily resembling our old, dilapidated oven. My husband leapt out of his chair, urging me to take action. "Quickly, do something!" he exclaimed, but before I could react, he pushed past me and began performing the Heimlich maneuver. "I don't think she's choking, Morgan. It appears to be an allergic reaction," I whispered. He stared at me in shock. "Allergic to what? Water? Call an ambulance," he bellowed. Sweat drenched my body, and my fingers trembled as I struggled to grip the phone. Perhaps this entire situation was a terrible mistake. "Why are you just standing there? Call them!" I wept as I shook uncontrollably. "I'm sorry, Morgan. This was a terrible idea. I knew it was a mistake." "A mistake? What are you talking about?" he demanded. "The cake, Morgan! It was the cake!" Ms. Horizo's condition deteriorated rapidly, and her face swelled significantly. As he released her drooping figure, he came to a sudden realization. "You've poisoned her," he declared, more as an observation than a question. "It's not poison," I replied, wiping my runny nose. "It's fish oil." He chuckled, an incongruous sound in the grim circumstances. "You did this for me?" he inquired. I wiped my teary eyes and nodded, feeling and appearing like a child. He rose from his seat, leaving Ms. Horizo lying motionless on the floor, her eyes already betraying the final throes of death. He hugged me, prying the phone from my quivering hands. "Maybe we should wait for a few minutes before calling the police, and when we do, we must inform them that it was an accident. Neither of us had any idea that the cake had fish oil, let alone that she was allergic to it," I suggested. As I glanced at him, I proposed another idea. We could even hold the company who manufactured the box accountable. They clearly made a significant mistake. He cupped my face with his big palms and kissed me deeply. "That's a brilliant idea. But before anything else, let's dispose of the remaining cake," he instructed.